Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me on the Godcast this week is Mark Crick. And Mark is a well-known photographer and he's also an author. And it's great to get you on, Mark. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm delighted to be here, Alex, on the Godcast, and very pleased to meet you and to discover. I hadn't known of the Godcast before, but I don't know how it had escaped my notice.
Well, it's not that well known, but I'm very proud of it, and I've had some wonderful guests on, and I'm sure you're going to add to that guest list, Mark. So thanks for coming on. It is appreciated.
My pleasure.
Let's go back a little bit more. Let's maybe look at Mark Crick as the in the time in your exuberance of youth. What were you like, and what were your kind of ambitions as a teenager growing up?
Oh God. Well, you won't tell from here, but I'm 6'5", and I was probably 6'1" as a sort of 14, 15 year old. So, so what was I like? I was not flamboyant, I don't think, like most tall, lanky teenagers. I tried to probably hide myself a bit. But um, what was I like? What were my ambitions? Probably to do some of the things I do now. I was growing up in a new town in Basildon in Essex, um, and I really appreciate the 60s architecture there now, but I probably fantasized about living in a medieval house or somewhere with a bit more history. And travel was a big thing. I think languages and seeing nobody went abroad. You know, our holidays were Norfolk and Kent, and probably from reading Paddington books, I fantasized about going to France. And, um,
Yeah, well, I love Paddington too.
anywhere.
What was Basildon like as a young guy? I mean, I live in Burnley, Mark, and people kind of give it the old Coronation Street image, rows and rows of terraced housing and smoking chimneys. What was it like growing up in Basildon?
Well, I mean, looking back, I think it was a kind of utopian experiment, and the whole town, all of my friends lived within walking distance. Most of the streets were pedestrian, with cycle tracks connecting, you know, the schools to the industrial estate where people's dads worked. And I think it was a great place to grow up. But we we maybe didn't appreciate that very much. We'd get the train when McDonald's appeared, we'd take a train ride to Southend, have a milkshake, and I don't know if we had a cinema. We had a community hall where a kindly uh, man with a projector showed films and on Saturday mornings. Um, and it was very oh fairly homogenous, you know, mostly Londoners whose parents had taken us there for a bit more greenery out from the east side of London, whether it was from Tottenham round to Woolwich, where my family came from. Uh, and I think it was had its challenges, but it was a great egalitarian town. It didn't have a posh neighbourhood. We
Mm.
didn't know it was a council estate because the whole town was a council estate, I
Yeah.
suppose.
And
Uh,
were you a well-behaved young man? Were you a good lad?
uh,
Yeah, and also,
yeah.
was being of a certain generation, was the church in the family unit? Was there a faith bringing of any sort, Mark?
No, not really. My parents. So I think. I mean, I don't. I've gradually picked this up. I have two great grandparents or great grandfathers from Cork, and I think one half of my family was Catholic and had had a. I know my grandfather described, you know, being given a beating by a nun and never going back to school from the age of 13. So I suspect there'd been a sort of rupture with the church at some point. Um, but you know, my school, like most schools then, we had big Janet Duke Junior School in Basildon. It was an old school, older than most of the town, and it had big hymn books, you know, about 6 foot high that were the pages were turned with a pole and a hook. Um, and my parents were they were definitely not anti-church, and I always liked churches. So our school church, St. Nicholas School, sat on a hill. I think it's about 1,000 years old. So that was always for my love of history. That was always a magical place to go to for Easter and Christmas services. But I think I probably went to the church more than my parents anyway. I'd go to school events and Christmas mass, and some of my friends were involved in the church and sort of young Christian groups. So, uh,
Yeah. And as you got older, Mark, was am I right in saying your immediate goal was to be a journalist? Is that right? Is that fair?
um, I think that yeah, that I liked writing. Don't know, somehow that came into my field of view. I'd always photography. I had a dark room in a friend's shed from about the age of 13. So photography was there somewhere. And I had probably a slightly outdated idea from old National Geographic magazines and the Sunday Times supplement that I could be a sort of roving photojournalist. I think by the time the 80s came and I was working, magazines were more interested in sort of lifestyle and 20 things that I read for the home and that sort of thing. So it was maybe I'd missed the golden age of this sort of 60s and 70s for that, perhaps.
And was it easy to become a professional photographer? Did you go down the college route and study about it? Just tell us a bit how that evolved for you.
Um, well, I studied. I went to university from Basildon, in a bit closer to you in Warwick, and studied French literature. And after that, I did a postgraduate in journalism. Um, but I suppose in one way it was easy in that most of the things I've done in life have come down to sort of luck and fortuitous drifting. So so I had gone out to magazines, and I'd gone and worked for a couple of weeks at the Times and other newspapers, but gradually I started selling features, either that a mate had written and I do the photographs, or vice versa, to the broadsheets. Um, but yeah, I don't know. I remember going to the London Illustrated News, and the editor at the time, Henry Porter, I think his name was, saying, "Why do you want to be a journalist? They don't earn any money. Be a photographer." I think the same applied to both. But and then by chance, in the end, it was a chance that I was sat in a cafe with some contact sheets of photographs, and a lady on the table next to me was the PR person for the London Symphony Orchestra. And some by some fluke, my first real job was for a quite well-known clients, really. Unfortunately, they didn't know that I would be drying the prints in my parents' bathroom and developing them in a garden shed. So so a bit of a fortune, really.
Yeah, I love your term fortuitous drifting. I think a lot of people can probably kind of align themselves with that. I think I can. I think for many years I wasn't sure where I was going or what I was doing, and sometimes I still think that now.
Yeah, I think I still am a fortuitous drifter, but I think the God or the universe looks kindly on people who are at least open to something. If you make some space and you do, I mean, usually I've been doing something anyway, not for a living, but whether I was making photographs or writing or drawing, um, if an opportunity might pop up, and if you're doing it at the time, well, that will help, helps you along, doesn't it? Um,
Yeah. So as you get your first proper job, getting paid to take photographs, did it move quite quickly from then? Were you? Well,
yeah,
and also, Mark, I'd like to. I asked this. I've had a lot of musicians on my Godcast. I recently had a guy called Joe Wobble from our. Probably you might know him from our
yeah.
generation.
He's performing, isn't he, at the moment somewhere?
Yeah,
I
he's
saw
he's
on
I think he's performing in Soho quite soon, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm
Um,
on a WhatsApp group with some friends from Basildon who are much more into the music scene than I am, and I saw that going around. So.
yeah, and I always ask musicians. I've not asked it. Well, in fact, I think you're the first photographer I've had on. But do you see your art form as a gift? Do you think it's something that you've just got in you?
It's it's a gift or a curse. It's a compulsion.
Yeah.
So, I can't stop myself taking pictures. And if I'm not taking pictures, I'm drawing pictures. So uh, I've got some compulsion to record things that I've seen, and I can't escape it really.
I did wonder what it's like for a photographer when you're not working. Is the mind always looking, observing,
Yeah,
spotting?
it's pretty much always the same. I sometimes think, well, you pay me or not, I'm probably still going to take the pictures. If it was, there may be some things you might choose not to photograph, but yeah, I'm always there's a camera next to me there, and I'm always seeing things, and for what purpose I don't even know, but I keep recording stuff. On holiday, I try not to take a camera and I take a sketchbook and some watercolors, so to at least give myself a break.
Yeah, and what about when everything went digital, Mark?
Yeah,
Was that an exciting transition for you? Does it remain exciting? Does it open up huge potential and possibilities that perhaps weren't there before?
I think. Well, yeah. I mean, I felt I was probably a bit like being a train driver, right? In the age of steam transition from steam to electric. Um, I was whatever young enough that it will seemed exciting. I think change is always coming, isn't it? And maybe there's a limited number of changes we're willing to adapt to, some of us. And so it was, yeah, it was exciting. It saved me because I was forever. My day would begin in a dark room or in going into Soho to collect film at a lab or drop film off. My day would end in Soho, dropping film off and collecting it. And as a consequence, I used to get a lot of parking tickets. I drove then. I don't drive anymore. But so so that yeah, that was a big change. I suppose people often you become a photographer because you don't want to be in an office, and I ended up spending a lot more time sat in front of a computer then, um, and that's definitely added a lot of possibilities, but a lot more takes a lot more of your time. Now a shoot, the time you spend taking the photographs is really the tip of the iceberg. Probably much like giving a sermon. There's a lot more to it than we see.
Yeah, yeah. And what about with digital technology and also AI now, Mark, how true are you to the original oil painting, as it were? Do you
No.
wander far from the photograph, or are you keen to keep it as authentic as it was as when you took it?
Yeah, I suppose yeah, I'm more of a photojournalist in that respect. I'm not. I don't work in the beauty world, and so yeah, I'm eager not to be cruel in photography. So I will, you're often trying to present people in the kindest light or the most sympathetic light. So there's always an element of transformation, isn't there, in a photograph, um, just as there can be in any, you're a what can I say? You have a role as a coach, perhaps in your community, and you'll be eager to accentuate the good in young people who come into your sphere rather than the bad. So I would take that same approach, but I'm not. A friend of mine is a retoucher, and he was doing some work for the American Football League, and he was asked to make all the muscles bigger. And he said, "Well, how big do you want to go?" And the guy said, "I want it to be an obscenity." So I'm not in that world, I'm generally. But if I was taking your photograph today, Alex, and I don't know, you'd got a spot on the end of your nose that day, I would probably get rid of it for you.
Good to know. That's good to know.
But
And
the
what
AI
about,
is a concern, obviously. It is
yeah,
a
yeah,
concern,
yeah. And what about the
and
subject matter, Mark? I was looking at your photographs and I stumbled across your work because I'm a huge fan of Depeche Mode and there's some images on there of the band, but then there are images of I love that image of the donkey on the beach facing the Central Pier at Blackpool. What is the and your also website says you'll go wherever, whenever, but what do you prefer? Do you prefer the kind of the moving image or the live image or just a mobile phone or whatever it is? What is your kind of preference?
oh God. I'm not so keen on mobile phones for some reason. I think they tend to distort that wide angle look. There's a lot of computer processing goes on in a mobile phone, and I think it gives too much detail, uh, too much noise into a picture. So I tend not to use those. But if you've got it, it's a great tool, and they're great for video if it's in your pocket. And I probably like to be in real life rather than in a studio. I'm not a product photographer. I couldn't shoot the perfect bottle of perfume, so I like to be I like to be somewhere that feels like I'm in real life with unpredictable things going on that are out of my control. And I think that's where I think photography shines really in its ability to capture the unexpected um, and the unpredictable, perhaps.
If you're taking a photograph of a person, Mark, do they ever irritate you like they want to control the shoot? Or do you just not allow that to happen? Do they have to trust in your
Uh,
work and your art form?
well, that would be, yeah, I mean, that would probably be my preference that they trust me. I mean, very rarely is there a clash between me and a sitter. Um, so very early on, somehow from the LSO job, I was in the auditorium at the Barbican, and somebody from the BBC was there, and my second client was the BBC, and somehow, I mean, I'd barely been working for very long, and I started getting commissions to go to Number 10 to photograph Mrs. Thatcher. And uh, she actually quite liked it if you were a bit bossy, really, and told her what you wanted. And she didn't have much time, and she didn't want you hesitating. So I guess I learned early on to sort of try and direct things with confidence. If you're confident, usually people around you are relaxed. Stand-up comedian who comes on, if he looks at home, the audience is relaxed, aren't they? If he looks terrified, um, nobody feels safe in the room. So usually, if all goes well and I'm confident, and happy, but occasionally, um, I'm nobody well known, I think, but we had a very well known local transvestite called Jessie, um, sort of 6'5" South African who went around all year through the winter in a tutu with a kind of bare legs and high heels. And he came around one day for me to take his photograph, and he was notoriously abrasive. And it began with me asking him a couple of, the normal introduction. It's a bit like a game of chess. You've got to begin with some basic moves. And he said, "This is so boring," asking him, when did he leave South Africa? And he started directing me. And um, yeah, and I think because so many people had exploited him as a 6'5" South African transvestite, people had made him look ridiculous, he felt, and so he arrived very defensively. And but that's a rarity, People are often uncomfortable in front of the camera, but they're usually fairly trusting.
Yeah. Something else I wanted to ask you, Mark, is I'm a priest. I'm a spiritual guy. Do you find there's something spiritual about being a photographer? I was I sit on this thing for my sins, the Church of England General Synod, which means I have to come down to London a couple of times a year. And I was there just a few weeks ago, and I was out over near Westminster Abbey, and I'm a real people watcher. I love watching people, and I was watching people queue up to have their photographs taken outside the telephone box, and I wanted to take a picture of them taking photos. But it was also it was a beautiful evening, and Big Ben was in the background. It was a beautiful backdrop, and I just found it really beautiful. I found it actually quite moving. Do you find that in your work?
Absolutely, yeah, all the time. And I find there is a spiritual element to, taking people's photographs. I feel it's often, I work quite a lot with, I suppose, in areas of non-profit and with charities. So I'm often photographing people with disabilities and learning disabilities, um, and it often feels like sort of there's something spirit. There's a profound sort of level of trust there that it's very easy to misrepresent somebody. It's very easy to exploit somebody with photography, and so I think, yeah, if I don't approach my work in some spiritual way, I don't think I'd be doing it justice. And I've never been a particularly commercial photographer, and I used to worry about that. But I think that's been, in the end, I think that's been a good thing. It's been
Yeah. And something just to touch on briefly, you're also a published author, Mark, aren't you? And I wondered, I'm going to plug my book. This is my book here. I was very lucky to be published by HarperCollins a few years ago. And
I
what
love
what
the
I
subtitle.
pardon?
I love the subtitle, From
Yeah,
Argos to the
from
Altar.
August to the Altar. That's me. But what I love about this is that it's been out a few years, but it still reaches people. I still get people get in contact and say whatever they say. Most of
Yes.
it's complimentary. Do you still enjoy that about what you publish, Mark? Does it still
Yeah,
happen?
yeah, yes, yeah, it still happens. And the book, they carry on having a life around the world. So one of them's having a Arabic translation at the moment. So yeah, so it's a nice thing, and it's taken me some beautiful places and met some extraordinary people. It's been and that was another bit of fortuitous drifting, really. Um, I was working on a project in Qatar, photographing Islamic art, and I met a publisher. We got talking about book ideas, and I mentioned an idea for a book, and she said, "Well, if you ever write it, let me know. I'll publish it." So I came home, had some spare time, and begun. So another fortuitous drift.
Do you think you might fortuitously drift into another one? Is there,
Yeah,
do you see that?
I mean, I've usually got something on the go. I think that photography and writing, as you all know, is it's an element of solitude to it, and you've really got to. Okay, you can write on the bus, I guess, but you've got to find sort of quiet and some stillness to write. And photography is the opposite. It takes you out into the world and meeting people. And I found after a sort of couple of years of concentrating on writing, I felt a little bit cut off from life in a way. And I think that brought me back to photography with a renewed enthusiasm. Um, but if you do a lot of photography and you find yourself chasing around all over the place, you're desperate to sit in the back room with a book in front of you, So, so yes, I'm sure I will. I'm sure that I'll drift back to that.
Yeah. And what's this year looking like for you, Mark? Have you got a busy diary? Do you like to have a full diary, or do you like to just allow space to just unwind and do your
I
own
think
thing?
I'm getting more comfortable with space. I used to. Somebody described me as sort of I was on a rodeo, seeing if I could stay on the horse. My diary used to be so busy that there was no space in it to even to look at myself, I suppose. And I've become more comfortable with with space there. So I'm glad to have some slack in the system, but I like to I like to see a few projects or have a couple of projects on the go, and and I like to see a few things in the diary. But photography tends to work. It's on often on quite short time scales, so things get booked in with a month's notice. So and the your outlook changes very quickly. So I've got some photography projects booked in, and I like to make space for some other creative projects. So I've been working with a friend of mine who's a documentary maker, and we have a project on focusing on the Klingon language. He's a great Trekkie, and we've been tracking down Klingon speakers.
Okay.
Are you a Trekkie yourself?
No, I'm not really. No, no, I'm embarrassingly not. I'm not really. I don't. I've never watched Harry Potter. I've never watched Star Wars. I'm just a dreadful, shocking mess, really. I
Well, I don't. There's no shame in that, and you've got them to look forward to if you're. Well, I'd recommend Star Wars. The first ones are very good, but
yeah, yeah,
yeah. So, but the project. The interest is con languages. So there's the recent Avatar film. There's about 1.5 million speakers of Nervi, the language in there, and
yeah.
the Klingon language. It started as some made-up sounds invented by Scotty, the ship's mechanic. They quickly realized that the audience were paying attention and connecting the subtitles with the sounds.
Right.
Realized there was no real language going on, so they had to invent one.
I love languages. I love regional accents. And a friend of mine is from London who's writing a book, and it's set in the north. And she wanted to come and learn about the language. And my wife and I took her out for lunch, and she said, just talk in the Burnley language. And we found it hilarious because we thought we sounded quite thick, to be honest. But she loved it, and she tried to characterize it. But I do love language, and particularly accents. I think Britain's got so many, in a short geographical space. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's
Accents are so precious, aren't they? Unfortunately, they do tend to. I'm sure David Beckham would. There was a lot of stick when he's away because of his accent that wouldn't have happened if he'd had a sort of, crystal RP BBC voice. And fortunately, more voices are welcome now, aren't they? We hear more of them. I keep hearing northern voices on Radio 3 that I probably wouldn't have heard before. So.
yeah. Well, I've been on Radio 4 this week, so there's a Northern Voice on Radio 4 this week. So, but
Okay. Where were you on?
I was on a documentary called File on 4, just been raising the issues of ketamine abuse in young people in Burnley. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay,
but
that's a
yeah,
going
important
for a lot of
stuff.
time, Fallon 4, hasn't it? So,
Yeah, it's really good. Do check it out. Smart, see what you think. But it's quite harrowing, but it's an important piece that I'm really proud of. So yeah. But listen, Mark, I've really enjoyed this time. It's gone really quickly for me, and I know you've said you've been to Burnley. We spoke briefly off camera. You're very welcome to Burnley. It's a really beautiful place. It gets a bit of a bad press, but we've got the most beautiful countryside, beautiful people, beautiful architecture. So if you are up here, you must give me a shout, and I'll
okay,
um,
I
I'll make you a
absolutely
brew and show the delights and speak some northern lingo.
yes, yeah, okay. Well, I'll definitely take you up on that. And likewise, if you're down when you're next in, well, at the Synod, it's only 30 minutes up the road.
Yeah, lovely. All right,
Yeah.
Mo. Well, thanks so much for coming on the Godcast. And if anybody, not if anybody, I hope you all have enjoyed listening or watching this podcast. Do check it out. There's lots of musicians, politicians, authors, priests. There really is something there for everybody. But for now, Mark, thanks for coming on. I really
Okay.
appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Alex. Take care. Bye bye.